Okay. Hey guys. I'm back again. I just wanna finish this chapter two real quick. I don't wanna waste time on one chapter. I'm just ready for chapter three. So I wanna continue with this chapter. It feels great to be back. You know. Yeah. So I'm just gonna walk you through what I've been talking about, what I've talked about. You know. Uh, through the past chapter, So, um, I talked about violations of the sure thing principle. I talked about do I have an appropriate level of confidence, I talked about sizing up the other party. In that, there are questions like who are the other parties, questions like are the parties monolithic, you know, some questions like that. We have things like issues mix. We have others interest and position. We have uh others negotiators partner. It's a weird BATNA. It's a weird. So I talked about those things. I talked about situation assessment or on the questions whether is there negotiation one shot, long term or repetitive. I talked about those things. I talked about do the negotiations involve scarce resources, ideologies, or both. I talked about is there negotiation and exchange or dispute situation. You know, I think I talked about those. I'm not quite sure, but yeah. Um, I think I ended up on is the negotiation one of necessity or opportunity. You know, uh, yeah, that's where I ended. So I'm going to continue on. Is there negotiation and exchange or dispute situation? You know, it's a question. It says is there negotiation and exchange or dispute situation? It says in a typical negotiation, right? Parties come together, okay, to attempt to exchange resources. It is the classic example a buyer sees greater value in a seller's goods than their seller wants for them, and an exchange take place, money is paid for goods or services, In other situations, negotiations take place because a claim has been made by one party and has been rejected by the other party, These aspects characterize a dispute situation, okay? For example, consider the dispute that involved the Michael Capellas, the CEO of WorldCom, renamed MCI, whose rivals allegedly avoided hundreds of millions of dollars in fees, over a decade by distinguishing long distance calls as local calls or as calls originated by its long distance competitor AT&T, right? It's an AT&T. The difference between exchanges and disputes concerns the alternatives, to mutual settlement. In an exchange situation, parties simply resort to their partners. Okay, in a classic dispute situation, they often go to court. Okay, so it says linkage effects present. Linkage effects, right, refers to the fact that some negotiations affect other negotiations. Probably the most obvious example is in the case of law and setting precedents. Resolution is one situation, have implications, okay, for other situations. For example, when the team sisters negotiated with the corporate parent of Jewel Supermarkets in 2003, right? Company management feared that if the Teamsters won a strong contract, it would serve as a template for unions at its other stores around the country. Okay. Albertsons, for example, had more than 400 labor contracts. Often direct linkages will occur when a multinational firm has operation in several countries. and a decision made in one country carries over to the other countries. Sometimes indirect linkage effects are also a factor, such as when a decision made at the negotiation tables affects some interest, group in a fashion that no one anticipates fully. For example, a key reason why mergers are often unsuccessful in that companies do not is that um, it says why mergers are it says, for example, right, a key reason why mergers are often unsuccessful is that the companies do not think about linkage effect with current employees. In most merger scenarios, employees of the purchased company are given little information um, about the turn of events, until well after the deal is settled. Okay, rumors fly about what's going on, and employees are left in limbo, bitter about changes and worried about their jobs and colleagues. Human resource specialists should be involved in the negotiation process to make the linkages for the employees smoother. For example, when baking soda uh, product manufacturer Chechen did so the acquire pharmaceutical company. Uh, the vice president of human resource was involved from the beginning to manage the linkages. Okay, within days of the acquisition, he held group meetings to explain the situation and lay out the transition strategy. So it says, is agreement required? Is an agreement required? An agreement between the two people, is it required? Is it? So in many negotiation situations, reaching agreement, right, is a matter of preference. Reaching an agreement is a matter of what? Of preference. For example, in a salary negotiation, a person might be willing to decline an offer from one company and either stay with the current company, okay, start his or her own company, or delay negotiations indefinitely. However, in other situations, reaching agreement is not only the only course of action, okay, it is required. For example, it is not the only course of action, it is required. For example, on August 17, 1981, when only the when more than 85% of the 17,500 air traffic controllers went on strike for better working conditions and improved wages, President Ronald Reagan told the controllers to return to work, or the government would assume that their striking controllers had quit. Uh, by the end of that week, more than 5,000 professional air traffic controllers organization, the PATCO, members received dismissal notices from the FAA. Reagan stated that Congress had passed a law in 1947 forbidding strikes by government employees, okay, including a non-strike oath that each air controller must sign upon hiring. Upon hiring, Another example, the Taylor law bars public employees from striking. This legislation gaining units representing 190,000 state employees. Negotiations can be automatically extended under the Taylor law if no new management is reached at the time of expiration. It is legal. Is it legal to negotiate? Is it legal to negotiate? So in the United States, it is illegal to negotiate the selling of human organs. In the United States, it is illegal to negotiate the selling of human organs. In September 1999, right, the online auction house eBay had to retract a seller's posted auction for a human kidney. You know, think of it, a human kidney. You know, the bidding went up to uh, $5.7 million. Okay, before eBay called off the auction. However, in the Philippines, it is legal to sell kidneys despite ongoing debate about the issue. So is it legal to negotiate? What do you think? So uh, uh let's continue. It is We continue to a sidebar, you know. It says, consider the desperation that must lead Romeo Roca, 36 of the Philippines, to do what he did. Romeo's 1-year-old son was sick with measles, and Roca needed cash to pay medical bills. He earned a $1.25 a day carrying sacks of rice at the harbor. You know, not enough to support his family of 5 children. Roca's stepfather, so about that, Roca's stepfather told him he could earn $2,000 or 125 by selling his kidney, said Roca. So he said he was forced to do it. He says it was a matter of survival, you know. The Roman Catholic Church denounced the business as unethical and exploitative. However, kidney patients are usually willing to pay any price just to live, you know. Imagine when you're in that situation of needing a kidney, right? You know, so doctors are seeking a middle ground with the objectives of preventing people from the commercializing organ donation. Hogan's kidney did not get him much. His son died, and the money has since run out. He tires easily with one only kidney, says Rosler. At least I've helped someone. You know, sometimes no specific law govern that can or cannot be negotiated. Rather, individuals rely on strong cultural norms than are highly situation specific. For example, most people in the United States do not negotiate the price of food at major grocery stores, you know, but they do it freely in farmers market, such as the Pike Place in market in Seattle, Washington, you know. But farmers markets are not the only place to uh, uh, hang on. For example, Bill Mayer, 41 years old father of six, really pays full price for anything. You know, in grocery stores, he tries to get buy-ins on food that is going to spoil if it is not so. You know, in thrift stores, he gets up a pile of stuff and offers a single price for it. At Pizza Palace, he asks for pizzas that have not been picked up and gets uh, 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 you know. So he's a good thinker. So he asks for pizzas that have not been picked up and gets them for $3 each. You know. So most home electronic stores will negotiate as well as stores that sell large durable goods. And when it comes to a college financial aid package, families often have more options than they realize and may be able to negotiate larger aid awards for their children. You know, so colleges will usually bulk the idea of negotiations, but will take another look if they see compelling reasons to do so. You know, so colleges don't want every parent asking for more money, but about 60% of the time, when parents acquire and are prepared, they get more money. You know, it is what it is. So, is ratification required? Is ratification required? So ratification, right, refers to whether a party to the negotiation table must have any contract approved by some other body or group. You know. So, for example, a corporate recruiter may need to have the salary and employment packages offered the recruits ratified by the company's human resource group or the CEO's. You know, in some circumstances, negotiators may tell the other side that ratification is required when it is not. So, is ratification required? You know, it is a question. Yeah. So we have to are time constraints or other time related costs involved. You know, are time constraints or other time related costs involved? That's what we want to know. All right. So it says virtually all negotiations, all of them, all of them, you know, all of them have negotiation, all of them have some time related costs, you know. Although the negotiator who desperately needs an agreement or for whom the passage of time is extremely costly is likely to be at a disadvantage, you know. So more time pressure is not necessarily bad. It is important to distinguish the final deadlines from time related costs, you know. two negotiators may face radically different time-related costs, but a deadline for one is a deadline for the other. You know, the shortest final deadline is the only one that counts, and if deal, they don't have a deal by that point. The two negotiators must exercise their partners. You know, time pressure and deadlines. A final deadline is a fixed point in time. Okay, that ends the negotiations. The rate of concession made by negotiators increase as negotiators approach final deadlines. You know, according to Moore, negotiators believe that final deadlines are a strategic weakness and so avoid revealing their deadlines for fear that their weakness will be exploited by opponents. However, in point of fact, you know, because deadlines restrict uh, the length of the negotiations for all parties, you know. So they place all parties under pressure. One person's final deadline is also the other's final deadline. For example, consider how Adam Chesnov revealed his deadline when in negotiations with Heimsaben. When time ran out of the negotiation, Chesnov came back with his own deadline, you know, so his wedding date. So he said, if you can't get the deal done by Friday, you won't have a problem with him or me. You will have to deal with my fiance, which is much more difficult conversation, you know. However, when negotiators kept the deadlines, the result is that they rush to get a deal before the deadline, whereas their opponent who expects longer negotiations could sail at a more leisurely pace, you know. For another example of strategic use of deadlines at AOL, you know, we have a sidebar here, you know. So it says strategic deadline pressure. It talks about that, you know, more of that. AOL used their knowledge of time pressure and deadlines in a strategic fashion, you know. AOL's strategy of creating an insane deadline would always begin with a what? A delicate courtship, you know. Okay. So it says AOL used their knowledge of time, right? Of time pressure and deadlines in a strategic fashion, okay? AOL's strategy of creating an insane deadline would always begin with a delicate courtship, okay? That would end up with an ultimatum that would leave the client reeling and usually a quizzing, you know. So AOL would begin negotiations as a law waltz between AOL and a prospective client, you know, involving lots of wooing and pretty much pretty words about how great the client's business was, you know. So how neat it would be if the two sides worked out. How wonderful it would be if the client bought ads on AOL. Actually, AOL didn't mention that it was having precisely the same slogans with multiple partners. Okay, so weeks would go by, then AOL would suddenly demand immediate action. Abruptly, deal makers would drop a contract, slam it on the table, and order the prospective client to sign it within 24 hours or less by the end of the day. Else, AOL would take the offer to another party. Okay, so which happened to be standing by. What's more, the contracts would always be of mammoth size, impossible to penetrate in the time constraints. Moreover, AOL executive made deal uh, makers of other companies sit around for hours in a so-called waiting game, you know, just to sign to them that they were not important, just to show them that they mean nothing. So, um, so I'm gonna head on two last paragraphs, okay, for the last time. It says the reason why negotiators so often incorrectly predict the consequences of final deadline in a negotiation has to do with the more general psychological tendency to focus egocentrically on the self when making comparisons or prediction. You know, negotiators focus on the deadline's effect on themselves more than its effect on the negotiating partners. You know, so the same tendency leads people to believe that they will be above average on simple tasks and below average on the difficult tasks. You know, listen to those things very carefully. You know, I don't want to make noise for a reason. You know. So setting a final deadline on the negotiation can be helpful. Why? Especially if the passage of time is particularly costly to you. This strategy was used successfully to reach an agreement in a National Basketball Association strike of 1998 to 1999. You know, the owners set a final deadline and threatened to walk out if they could not come to agreement with the players by January 5th, 1999. The two sides came to agreement on January 4th on terms that dramatically favored the owners' time horizon. So another time related questions concern about occasion the colleagues refer to as the time horizon, the amount of time between the negotiation and the consequences of realization of negotiated agreements. As a general principle, you know, the longer the temporal distance between the act of negotiation and the consequence of negotiated agreements, the better the agreement. I'm sorry about this, about lowering my voice. I'm lowering my voice for a reason, but I'm sorry about that, guys. But it is the last paragraph, so I think I'm ending. This is the last, the second last part of chapter two. When I come back, I'm gonna be heading to the last part of chapter two, so we can close chapter two. Okay, so it says, as a general principle, right, the longer the temporal distance between the act negotiation and the consequence of negotiation agreement, the better the agreement. The reason is that parties are less contentious since the realization is in the distance. Moreover, this time benefit is particularly pronounced in the cases where negotiations concern what burdens, okay, as opposed to benefits, because time gives people opportunity to discount the effects of burdens. Okay, so that's it for me. I'll see you. I think tomorrow or day after tomorrow. Have a blessed day. Cheers.